I'm going to show you a technique that has been around since the 16th century. But first we have to go back to the very beginning of the process. Nope, that's too far back. How about in a land far, far away? No, that's still too far back. Here we go. I'll be using 4/4 walnut to make this batch of charcuterie boards. I first ripped the boards down to 7 inches on the table saw, and then using the miter saw made my first cut at 15 degrees. But I thought it was a bit much for these smaller boards, so I recut them at 12 degrees, and that was perfect. Then I could cut them to length, which I believe was 12 inches. After that, I needed to flatten them, but my joiner's not wide enough, so I hot glued them to a known flat board, marked it with a pencil so I could see when it was flat, and ran each of them through the planer until the marks were gone. Once one side was done, I marked the back side and ran it through again. And I like to test the flatness of the board using the table saw. Then I head over to the oscillating sander where these boards will really start to take shape. I generally start by rounding off the corners, and then I let the sander dig in a bit in a few spots on the sides. Though you really do have to play around to get the look you want. But don't rush this part because it will determine how the board looks in the end. After that, I used my orbital sander with some 80 grit sandpaper to soften the edges left behind. To give it a more rustic look, the goal is to make the board look like it's been worn down naturally. So in the areas that I let the oscillating sander dig in, I'll soften those edges more than in other areas. One key to this process is inconsistency. You don't want to make any patterns. And again, remember to not rush this process because it's what makes this board look rustic when it's finished. After that, I take some sandpaper and by hand clean up any rough spots and feather out any sharp edges left behind by the sander. Although the sander gives you the shape you want, this next step will give you the rustic feel and really takes these boards to the next level. I use a wire wheel in my drill, and going with the grain, I slowly work my way across the board. And what this does is remove the softer wood, leaving the harder wood grain behind and giving you a more weathered feel and look. And of course, make sure to get the edges. The next step is to bang it up a little bit. And you can do this in a lot of different ways, like dropping some chains on it to give small, soft dents in the wood. But I find this method doesn't really do much on hardwoods like walnut. Another option is to use a hammer on its side and just rock it back and forth to create dents. And this will give you some longer, slightly curved lines. But like any method, you'll need to play around a bit until you find the one that gives you the results you want. One other thing I like to do that gives a lot of character in the wood is to take a finish nail because it has a rounded head and randomly tap it with a hammer to give you some deeper dents. Now you can use just about anything to bang up the wood, but I find the hammer on edge and a finish nail typically gives me the results that I'm looking for. So to make your wood look like black ebony, we're going to use a little trick called ebonizing. What you do is you take some white vinegar and some steel wool. I've got the 4/0. We're going to put a little bit of white vinegar, half of a pad of steel wool, and you're going to soak it in there for 48 hours up to 2 weeks, depending on how dark you want your wood to come out. So we're going to let that set, and we'll continue working on the rest of the project. This solution is called iron acetate, and by my understanding, this process called ebonizing has been around since the 16th century. And how it works is the iron acetate and the tannins in the wood react and create this black ebony look. Therefore, the wood that has a naturally higher amount of tannins will react more than woods that naturally have a lower amount of tannins in them. So I wanted to show you what happens if you use your solution too quickly. Now this sat in here for only a couple of hours, and then I went ahead and ran it over this to see what kind of look that I was going to get, and it definitely kind of washed out the darker colors and made this kind of a grayish aged look to it, which is kind of cool, but it's not what I'm going for. What you can see here is I've got a piece that of a leftover cutoff, and you can see the color difference between the two with this solution just sitting for, like I said, it was about 2 hours or so, and it definitely washed it out. And now it's been sitting for 2 days, and we're going to see if I can get this even darker, which it should do. Applying iron acetate is very easy. I typically apply it using a rag and just wipe it on. The ebonizing process will start happening pretty quickly, and within 30 minutes to an hour, it's finished. However, you need to let it completely dry before starting the next step. So now that our iron acetate has completely dried and it's been sitting here for about 48 hours now, you can see just how black this material has gotten. And when you compare it to an unfinished piece of the walnut, you can just see how much or how well this really works. It's a pretty cool process. Hey, if you've made it this far in the video, I'm going to give away a charcuterie board like these to one of my subscribers after getting 100 likes. So hit that like button and just start your comment with the word ebony so I know you watched my video. Then you'll automatically be entered to win, and I'll ship it to you free within the US in the lower 48. Okay, once the material is completely dry, I take a sanding block with some 120 grit and start sanding it down to get the look I want. You can use an orbital sander if you want to see more of the natural wood underneath, but it can easily remove more than you want. And if that happens, it's not a big deal. Just reapply more of that iron acetate, let it dry, and sand it again. You want to focus on the areas that would get the most wear, like the edges and flat surfaces. Don't try and get down into the low areas because you want that color contrast to be darker in the lower spots, and you want the higher areas to be more distressed and look worn. So after you're done distressing the wood and you're happy with how it turned out, you can see these little divots that are in the wood that we created with the nails, the hammer, and the chain. And now we're satisfied. We don't want to do anything else to it. And now it's time to put something on to protect all the work that you just did. Now, there's two ways that I typically use it, and there's a lot of other methods out there, but these are the two that I've tried out. One of them is, of course, walrus oil. And that works pretty good, but the biggest problem that I have with it is that it has coconut oil in it. And one of the clients that I'm sending one of these boards to is very, very allergic to coconut oil in general. So that one is out, which leaves me with this other one here. And this is a Lancaster wood wax. I've used it a few times on boards when I've done this black ebony distressed look to them, and it tends to work pretty good. So this is what I'm going to use on at least one of these boards, and then once this one's set aside and I know it's protected, then I'll come back with the walrus oil and I will use that on the other two, just because I have a larger container of it and it is less expensive than this small container of Lancaster wood wax. I like using these wax applicator pads that I store separately with each wax so there's no cross-contamination. Once I have some wax on the pad, I typically apply it in the direction of the grain and then a circular motion to work it into all of the grooves. Now you'll want to check the instructions on whichever product you're using, because one of these says to wipe it off after 15 minutes, while the other says to wait 4 to 8 hours before wiping it off. I really don't know why more woodworkers don't use this ebonizing process, because it gives you a very unique black ebony look.